Sometimes the cruelest bet can become the greatest blessing. In 1847, loneliness had eaten away at more hearts in Cedar Falls, Montana, than the harsh winters ever could. Silas Grizzly McGraw was the toughest mountain man anyone had ever seen. He lived alone in the wilderness, trading animal pelts and avoiding people. After 15 years of solitude, he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about him. That autumn night, drunk and angry after losing at cards, Silas made a foolish wager. "I'll marry any woman in this town," he announced to the laughing crowd at Murphy's saloon. "Even the fattest one." Everyone pointed to Abigail Thompson at the general store. They thought it would be a joke. They had no idea that Abigail had been waiting her whole life for someone brave enough to see past appearances. What would happen when this lonely mountain man discovered he'd married the strongest woman in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, 1847. The town clung to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, like a determined tick on a bear's hide. Main Street was nothing more than a muddy stretch between Murphy's Saloon, Henderson's General Store, and the Presbyterian Church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. Beyond the scattered wooden buildings, the wilderness stretched endlessly, a domain where only the hardiest souls could survive, and even fewer could thrive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement as Abigail Thompson unlocked the heavy door of Henderson's General Store. At 28, she had accepted her place in the world's narrow view of unmarried women. Her generous figure, kind face, and sharp brown eyes had made her the subject of whispered conversations and cruel jokes among the townspeople. What they didn't see was the way her hands moved with precision as she counted inventory, or how her mind calculated complex orders without pencil and paper. Behind the counter, tucked beneath bolts of calico and wool, lay her most treasured possession, her mother's recipe book. The leather-bound volume contained more than instructions for cornbread and preserves. Between the faded pages, her mother had written observations about people, notes on herbal remedies, and small bits of wisdom gathered from a lifetime of watching and learning. "Judge a man not by his words in public, but by his actions when no one's watching," read one margin note. "A woman's worth isn't measured by her waist, but by the width of her heart and the depth of her mind." Abigail had memorized every word. 15. Miles northeast, Silas McGraw woke in his one-room cabin with a head that felt like it had been kicked by a mule. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The poker game, the whiskey, the laughter, and most damning of all, his own voice declaring he'd marry the fattest woman in town. He sat up on his narrow cot, running calloused hands through graying hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. At 42, Silas carried the scars of a hard life etched into his weathered face. A jagged line ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from a grizzly bear that had objected to sharing its fishing spot. His hands, broad and powerful from years of trapping and survival, bore the permanent stains of gunpowder and animal blood. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Steel gray and cautious, they held the weight of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. The cabin reflected its owner's solitary existence. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding traps, ammunition, and a few dog-eared books. The Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, and a guide to Rocky Mountain flora. His bed occupied one corner, while a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs filled the center. The second chair had remained empty for 15 years. Silas dressed slowly, his movements deliberate despite the pounding in his skull. He'd built this life deliberately, isolated, self-sufficient, free from the complications that came with caring about others. Every winter he survived alone, reinforced his belief that solitude was safer than the risk of loss. The townspeople knew him only as a legend, the mountain man who could track a wolf through a blizzard, who traded the finest pelts but never stayed long enough for conversation. What they didn't know was that Silas McGraw had once been different. Before the mountains claimed him, he'd been a man who believed in justice, in protecting the innocent, in building something lasting with another person. But that life belonged to someone else now, buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot. It existed. Back in town, word of the previous night's spectacle spread like wildfire through Cedar Falls' small population. Martha Henderson, the general store owner's wife, bustled through the settlement with the efficiency of a woman carrying particularly juicy gossip. "Can you believe it?" she whispered to Eleanor Murphy outside the church. "That wild man actually said he'd marry poor Abigail Thompson, right there in front of God and everybody." Eleanor clicked her tongue with practiced disapproval. "It's shameful, that's what it is, making sport of that poor girl. She's got enough troubles without becoming the subject of some drunkard's cruel joke." But their conversation carried on the morning breeze, reaching other ears. By noon, the town was placing bets on whether the mountain man would actually follow through, while the other half debated the moral implications of such a wager. The general consensus was clear. Silas McGraw would either sober up and disappear back to his mountain refuge, or he'd go through with the marriage as an elaborate prank that would humiliate Abigail Thompson in front of the entire community. None of them knew Abigail very well. At the general store, she continued her daily routine with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown for 7 years. Customers came and went. Farmers needing supplies, wives selecting fabric, children eyeing the penny candy with longing. To each person, she offered the same polite service and gentle smile, even as she heard the whispered conversations about her supposed engagement to the infamous mountain man. "You poor dear," clucked Mrs. Pemberton, selecting thread for her quilting. "Don't you worry yourself about that nonsense from last night. No decent man would hold another to such a ridiculous promise." Abigail nodded and wrapped the thread carefully. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Pemberton." What she didn't say was that she'd been thinking about Silas McGraw all morning. Not about the bet or the humiliation it might bring, but about the man himself. She'd seen him during his infrequent visits to town, always courteous but distant, paying for supplies with coins or pelts, never causing trouble despite his fearsome reputation. There was something in his grey eyes that spoke to her, a loneliness that matched her own. For 28 years, Abigail had watched life happen around her. She'd seen friends marry and start families, watched younger women receive courtship visits and wedding proposals. She'd accepted her role as the spinster, who minded the store, helped with difficult births, and tended the sick. But acceptance didn't ease the ache of going to bed alone every night, of having no one to share the small joys and sorrows that made up a life. The afternoon sun slanted through the store's windows when the bell above the door chimed. Abigail looked up from her ledger to see a figure that made her heart skip, not from fear, but from possibility. Silas McGraw stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. He'd cleaned up since the night before. His hair was combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore what appeared to be his best shirt, though it had seen better days. More importantly, his eyes were clear and sober, meeting hers directly. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice deep and respectful, "I believe we need to talk." The store fell silent. Mrs. Pemberton froze with a bolt of fabric halfway off the shelf. Two farmers stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Even the flies seemed to pause in their buzzing. Everyone waited to see if the mountain man had come, to apologize for his drunken foolishness or to compound it with further cruelty. Abigail set down her pencil and smoothed her apron. "Mr. McGraw, I suppose we do." He glanced around at the gathered audience, his jaw tightening slightly. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" She nodded toward the back room where Mr. Henderson stored excess inventory. "We can talk back there." As they moved through the store, whispers followed in their wake. Abigail led him past barrels of flour and salt, stacks of blankets, and crates of canned goods. The back room smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee beans, and soap, the mingled scents of frontier commerce. Silas closed the door behind them and stood for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his words were measured and honest. "Miss Thompson, I need to apologize for last night. What I said, the bet I made, it was the whiskey talking, but that's no excuse. I had no right to involve you in such foolishness or to make you the subject of the town's amusement." Abigail studied his face, noting the genuine regret in his expression. "Thank you for the apology, Mr. McGraw. I accept it." He nodded, relieved. "I'll make it clear to everyone that the whole thing was nonsense. You shouldn't have to endure their speculation and gossip because of my stupidity. And if I don't want you to?" The question hung between them like smoke from a campfire. Silas blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" Abigail took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a cliff with the choice to either step back to safety or leap into the unknown. What if I said yes? For the first time in 15 years, Silas McGraw was completely speechless. He stared at this woman, this brave, unexpected woman, and felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking up on a mountain stream. "You can't be serious," he said finally. "I'm 28 years old, Mr. McGraw. I've been serious about most things for quite some time." Abigail's voice was steady, but he could see her hands trembling slightly. "I know what people think of me. I know what they say. But I also know that I'm tired of living half a life, watching everyone else find companionship while I tend other people's needs." Silas felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitude beginning to crack. "Miss Thompson, Abigail, you don't know what you're saying. I'm not a man built for marriage or family. I live alone in the mountains. I haven't had a real conversation with another person in months. Then perhaps it's time you did." He ran his hand through his hair, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "This is madness. We don't know each other. We have nothing in common. Both know what it's like to be alone," she said quietly. "We both understand what it means to be judged by appearances rather than character. And we both know that this town expects us to fail." Something in her tone made him stop pacing and look at her directly, really look at her. Beyond the soft curves that had made her the target of cruel jokes, he saw intelligence in her brown eyes, strength in the set of her shoulders, and a kind of quiet courage that reminded him of the mountain women who'd helped build the frontier. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you even consider such a thing?" Abigail met his gaze steadily. "Because I believe that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Because I think you're a better man than you give yourself credit for. And because I'd rather take a chance on something real than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Outside, they could hear the murmur of voices as the store's customers speculated about their private conversation. In a few minutes, they would have to rejoin that world and face whatever consequences their decision might bring. But for now, in this quiet space that smelled of possibility and change, two lonely souls stood on the threshold of transformation. Silas looked at Abigail Thompson, truly looked at her, and saw not the town's cruel joke, but a woman of courage, intelligence, and surprising grace. A woman who had just offered him something he thought he'd lost forever, the chance to be more than the sum of his solitary existence. The mountain man who had spent 15 years running from connection felt the first stirrings of something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. 3 days later, Cedar Falls witnessed something unprecedented, a wedding that nobody quite knew how to categorize. Was it romantic, tragic, an elaborate joke that had gone too far? The answer seemed to shift, depending on who was watching and what they chose to see. Reverend Porter stood uncomfortably at the altar of the small church, his worn Bible open to the familiar passages about marriage. He'd performed dozens of wedding ceremonies over his 12 years in Cedar Falls, but none quite like this one. The groom towered beside him, 6 feet 4 inches of mountain-hardened muscle barely contained in a borrowed suit that strained at the shoulders. Silas had spent the morning at the barber shop, emerging clean-shaven and presentable, though his eyes held the wariness of a wild animal forced into civilization. The pews were packed, not with well-wishers, but with curious onlookers who'd come to witness what they assumed would be either a spectacle or a disaster. Some had even placed bets on whether Silas would bolt before the ceremony concluded. The general consensus was that this marriage would last about as long as snow in July. They underestimated both the bride and groom. Abigail entered the church wearing her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her fuller figure. The ivory silk, though 20 years old, still held its elegance. She'd pinned her dark hair in a simple but becoming style, adorned with wildflowers she'd gathered herself that morning. Most remarkably, she walked down the aisle with her head held high, meeting the curious stares with quiet dignity. When she reached the altar and took her place beside Silas, something unexpected happened. He offered her his arm, not from obligation but from genuine courtesy. She accepted it with a small smile that seemed to surprise them both. In that moment, the watching crowd caught a glimpse of what neither the bride nor groom had anticipated. They looked right together. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Porter began, his voice gaining strength as he fell into the familiar rhythm of the ceremony. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Silas McGraw and Abigail Thompson in holy matrimony." As the words washed over them, both Silas and Abigail found themselves transported beyond the church walls and curious stares. They had spent the previous 3 days in careful conversation, getting to know each other with a frankness that surprised them both. Silas had shared stories of mountain life, of surviving blizzards and wildlife encounters. Abigail had revealed her love of books, her skill with numbers, and her dreams of teaching children to read. They discovered they both enjoyed the poetry of Walt Whitman. Both had lost parents too young, and both possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged once the initial awkwardness faded. More importantly, they had agreed on the practical aspects of their arrangement. This would be a marriage of companionship and mutual respect, with physical intimacy developing naturally, if at all. "Do you, Silas, take Abigail to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Silas looked down at the woman beside him, seeing not the town's cruel joke, but a person of genuine courage who had chosen hope over safety. "I do," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Do you, Abigail, take Silas to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Abigail met his gray eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: gratitude. This man, who had lived alone by choice for 15 years, was genuinely thankful that she had been brave enough to say yes. "I do," she replied, her voice steady and sure. The ring ceremony proved momentarily awkward. Silas hadn't thought to purchase wedding bands, but the town blacksmith, moved by an unexpected moment of sentimentality, stepped forward with 2 simple silver rings he'd crafted that morning from spare wire. They were rough and unpolished, but they caught the afternoon light streaming through the church windows like promises made tangible. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Porter concluded. "You may kiss the bride." This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the awkward finale to an impossible situation. But when Silas gently cupped Abigail's face in his weathered hands and kissed her with surprising tenderness, the watching crowd fell silent. This wasn't the performance of a cruel joke. This was 2 people choosing to honor their commitment to each other, whatever that might mean. The kiss was brief but genuine, and when they separated, both were slightly breathless. Silas offered Abigail his arm once more, and together they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, leaving behind a congregation that suddenly wasn't quite sure what they had witnessed. Outside the church, the newlyweds faced a receiving line of sorts, townspeople offering congratulations that ranged from sincere to bewildered. Martha Henderson pressed a basket of food into Abigail's hands. "For your first week," she said, then added quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." Dear, so do I, Abigail replied honestly. The brief reception in the church hall was stilted and strange. Silas stood beside his new wife, accepting handshakes and well-wishes while looking like he'd rather face a charging grizzly. Abigail smiled and thanked people for their gifts. A few kitchen items, some fabric, a lamp that someone clearly wanted to get rid of. But through it all, she maintained her composure, playing the part of a happy bride, even though she had no idea what her marriage would actually become. As the afternoon wore on, the reality of their situation began to settle on both of them. They were married now, legally bound to each other in a frontier community where divorce was nearly impossible and social support for failed marriages was non-existent. They would have to make this work, whatever this turned out to be. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Silas approached his wife with a question that had been weighing on his mind all day. "Abigail," he said quietly, using her first name for only the third time since they'd met, "are you ready to see your new home?" She looked around the church hall at the familiar faces, the life she was leaving behind. For a moment, doubt flickered across her features. Then she straightened her shoulders, picked up her small traveling bag, and nodded. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The ride to Silas's mountain cabin took 3 hours on horseback. He'd borrowed a gentle mare for Abigail, though she proved to be a more accomplished rider than he'd expected. As they climbed the winding trail that led away from Cedar Falls and deeper into the wilderness, civilization fell away behind them like shed clothing. The landscape changed from the gentle foothills around town to serious mountain country. Steep ridges covered in pine and aspen, rocky outcroppings that spoke of ancient geological upheaval, and valleys so deep that shadows pooled in them like dark water. It was beautiful and intimidating in equal measure, a place where nature ruled absolutely and human beings survived only through skill, preparation, and respect for forces beyond their control. Abigail had never been this far from town, but she found herself genuinely impressed by the raw majesty of Silas's world. When they paused to rest the horses beside a mountain stream, she stood quietly, taking in the vastness of the landscape, while Silas watched her reaction carefully. "It's not what you're used to," he said, giving her an opportunity to change her. "A mind?" "No," she agreed. "It's more." By the time they reached the cabin, twilight was painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Silas's home sat in a natural clearing beside another stream, surrounded by towering pines that had probably stood since before Columbus reached the New World. The cabin itself was larger than Abigail had expected, 2 rooms plus a loft. Built from local timber with the kind of solid craftsmanship that comes from necessity rather than aesthetics. Silas dismounted and helped Abigail down from her horse, their hands touching briefly in a moment that felt both natural and electric. He showed her around the property, the vegetable garden he maintained, the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the workshop where he repaired traps and equipment. Everything spoke of a man who had built a life of complete self-sufficiency. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by shelves holding books, supplies, and the tools of mountain living. The furniture was handmade, but sturdy. What struck Abigail most was how everything had its place. This was the home of a man who lived by routine and order, who had eliminated chaos from his life by eliminating unpredictability. She was the ultimate unpredictability. "The loft is yours," Silas said, gesturing toward a ladder that led to a small sleeping area under the eaves. "I'll take the main room until we figure out what kind of marriage this is going to be." His words were practical, but Abigail heard the underlying question, what have we done? And more importantly, what do we do now? Standing in her new home, surrounded by the life her husband had built in solitude, Abigail felt the full weight of her decision settling around her like a heavy cloak. She had left behind everything familiar, her job, her friends, her daily routines, to marry a man she barely knew, and move to a place where the nearest neighbor was miles away. But as she looked around the cabin, she also saw possibilities. The main room would benefit from curtains and a few decorative touches. The kitchen area, while functional, could be organized more efficiently. And that second chair at the table, the one that had sat empty for 15 years, finally had an occupant. Silas, she said, setting down her traveling bag and meeting his uncertain gaze. What kind of marriage do you want this to be? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Silas had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, ever since this impossible woman had surprised him by saying yes to his drunken proposal. He studied her face in the lamplight, intelligent, determined, and surprisingly beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with the shallow standards that governed town gossip. "I want it to be real," he said finally, "whatever that means for us." Abigail smiled, and for the first time since their wedding ceremony, it reached her eyes. "Then I suppose we'd better get started figuring it out." Outside, the mountain night settled around the cabin like a protective blanket. Inside, two people who had begun as strangers, brought together by a cruel bet, started the delicate process of building something that neither had dared to hope for, a true partnership. The simple silver ring on Abigail's finger, crafted hastily from bent wire, caught the firelight and sparkled like a promise. What had started as the town's joke was becoming something else entirely, though neither the bride nor groom could yet imagine how profoundly this night would change both their lives. Dawn came early to the mountains, arriving with a symphony of birdsong and the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Abigail woke in the loft to unfamiliar sounds and the scent of wood smoke drifting up from below. For a moment she lay still, remembering where she was and why. Married to a mountain man, living in a cabin miles from civilization. The reality might have been overwhelming if not for the sounds coming from the main room. The careful clink of dishes, the soft thud of firewood being added to the flames, the quiet competence of someone preparing breakfast without trying to wake a sleeping spouse. Thoughtfulness, Abigail realized. Her new husband was being considerate. She dressed quickly in the practical clothing she'd brought, a simple brown dress that could withstand mountain life, sturdy boots, and an apron her mother had embroidered years ago. From her small sewing kit, she retrieved the one luxury she'd insisted on bringing, a set of fine needles and strong thread that could mend anything from clothing to leather goods. If she was going to make a life in the wilderness, she intended to make herself useful. Climbing down the ladder, she found Silas crouched beside the fireplace, stirring something that smelled like heaven in a cast-iron pot. He'd already dressed for the day in worn buckskins and a flannel shirt, his hair still damp from washing in the stream. When he heard her approach, he looked up with an expression that was part welcome, part uncertainty. "Morning," he said quietly. "I hope I didn't wake you." "The birds did that," Abigail replied, surprised by how natural it felt to exchange morning pleasantries with this man she barely knew. "What are you cooking?" "Porridge with dried berries. Coffee's ready if you'd like some." She accepted the tin. "Cup," he offered, inhaling the rich aroma of what was clearly better coffee than anything served in town. Silas noticed her surprise and allowed himself a small smile. "One of the benefits of dealing directly with traders," he explained. "I get first pick of the good supplies." They ate breakfast in comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that comes, not from awkwardness, but from two people learning each other's rhythms. Abigail observed how Silas moved, economically, never wasting motion or energy. He ate with focused attention, clearly a man who had learned not to take food for granted. When he finished, he cleaned his dishes immediately, maintaining the orderly system that kept his solitary life running smoothly. "What's the plan for today?" Abigail asked as she helped wash the remaining dishes in a basin of heated water. Silas. He paused, realizing he'd never had to consider another person's needs or interests in his daily routine. I need to check the trap lines up valley. Winter's coming, and the fur won't be prime much longer. May I come with you? The question clearly surprised him. It's a long day's walk, rough country, and the work isn't pleasant. I'm stronger than I look, Abigail said calmly, and if I'm going to live here, I should understand how we make our living. Silas studied her face, looking for signs of the delicate sensibilities he'd expected from a town-raised woman. Instead, he saw genuine curiosity and a practical determination that reminded him why he'd agreed to this marriage in the first place. All right, he decided, but you'll need different clothes. Mountain travel requires freedom of movement. From a chest in the corner, he produced a set of modified men's clothing, pants and a shirt that had been altered for a smaller frame. These belonged to a trapper's wife who passed through last spring. She traded them for supplies when her husband decided they were heading back to civilization. Abigail accepted the clothes without complaint, recognizing their practical value. While she changed in the loft, Silas packed supplies for their day. Water, dried meat, his rifle, and the tools needed to service his trap lines. By the time she climbed back down, dressed in the practical mountain clothing, he was ready to go. The transformation was remarkable. Freed from the restricting layers of town fashion, Abigail moved with a natural grace that had been hidden beneath proper skirts and tight bodices. The clothing revealed not just her figure's true proportions, more athletic and less awkward than town gossip suggested, but also a physical capability that came from years of hard work in the general store. Better, Silas approved, then caught himself. I mean more practical for mountain travel. I know what you meant, Abigail said, and he heard amusement in her voice rather than offense. Their first trap was less than a mile from the cabin, set beside a game trail that wound through a grove of aspen trees. Silas had caught a beaver, which he dispatched quickly and humanely before explaining his trapping philosophy to his wife. Take only what you need, and use every part of what you take, he said, demonstrating how to skin and prepare the animal. The mountain provides, but it doesn't give gifts to those who waste them. Abigail watched carefully, asking practical questions about technique and storage. She didn't flinch at the blood or the reality of where meat and fur came from. Another pleasant surprise for Silas, who had expected squeamishness from a woman raised in town comfort. By the time they reached the fourth trap, she was carrying her share of the equipment and keeping pace without complaint. More importantly, she was contributing observations about game signs and trail conditions that proved she'd been paying attention to everything he'd shown her. You're a natural at this, Silas said as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. Most people from town can't even find their way back to the cabin after one trip. Most people from town don't have to memorize complex inventory systems and track dozens of different supply routes, Abigail replied. Reading the landscape isn't so different from reading account books. You just have to pay attention to the patterns. It was a perspective Silas had never considered, and it made him see his wife in a new light. She wasn't just adapting to mountain life, she was applying skills she already possessed to master it. Intelligence was proving more valuable than physical strength, and Abigail had plenty of both. Their conversation during the day ranged from practical matters, how to predict weather changes, which plants were edible, where to find the best materials for repairs, to more personal topics. Silas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, while Abigail revealed dreams and ambitions she'd kept hidden during her years of quiet service in the general store. I always wanted to teach children, she admitted, as they walked between trap sites. Not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think for themselves, how to see possibilities instead of just accepting limitations. Why didn't you? The town already had a teacher, and he wasn't interested in having female assistants. Besides, unmarried women who get too many ideas about independence make people nervous. Silas considered this as they climbed a particularly steep section of trail. Out here, independence isn't a luxury, it's survival. And thinking for yourself. Isn't radical, it's necessary. Is that why you left civilization? The question hung between them as they crested the ridge and stopped to admire the view. Below them, the valley spread out like a green carpet, dotted with lakes that reflected the afternoon sky. It was beautiful and vast and utterly empty of human presence, except for the thin line of smoke rising from their cabin in the distance. Partly, Silas said finally, I got tired of people telling me what was important, what was worth fighting for, what kind of man I should be. Out here, the mountains don't care about your reputation or your politics or whether you fit into someone else's idea of normal. They just care if you're competent enough to survive. Exactly. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the cabin, Abigail felt a sense of accomplishment she'd never experienced in town. Her muscles ached from the day's hiking. Her hands were stained with trap grease and beaver blood, and she had learned more about wilderness survival in 8 hours than in her previous 28 years. But more than that, she had proven to herself and to her husband that she could contribute to their partnership as an equal. Silas, meanwhile, found himself appreciating not just Abigail's adaptability, but her company. For 15 years, his evenings had been silent except for the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the mountain night. Now he had someone to share observations with, someone whose different perspective made familiar territory seem new and interesting. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Abigail working on mending a shirt while Silas cleaned his rifle, the comfortable domestic scene felt surprisingly natural. Neither of them mentioned that they were still essentially strangers, or that their marriage was still more arrangement than romance. Instead, they fell into the easy rhythm of two people learning to share space and responsibilities. Silas, Abigail said, as she carefully stitched a torn seam, thank you for today, for treating me like a partner instead of a burden. He looked up from his rifle maintenance, surprised by the gratitude in her voice. You earned it. Most people couldn't have handled what we did today, male or female. In town, people always assumed I was fragile because of my appearance. It's nice to be judged by what I can do instead of what I look like. Silas set down his cleaning rod and studied his wife's face in the firelight. For what it's worth, I think the people in town are fools. They saw what they expected to see instead of looking at what was actually there. It was perhaps the kindest compliment Abigail had ever received, and coming from a man who chose his words carefully, it carried weight. She felt something shift in her chest, not love, not yet, but the foundation upon which love might eventually be built. Outside, the mountain night wrapped around their cabin like a protective embrace. Inside, two people who had married as strangers were beginning to discover that they might, against all odds, actually like each other. 2 weeks into their marriage, Abigail had transformed the cabin from a bachelor's functional shelter into something approaching a home. Curtains made from traded fabric softened the windows. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the sense of sage and mint. Most significantly, she had rearranged the kitchen area with an efficiency that impressed even Silas, who had thought his systems were already optimal. The morning routine had settled into comfortable predictability. Silas woke first, built up the fire and started coffee. Abigail descended from the loft as the cabin warmed, greeting him with increasing familiarity. They prepared breakfast together, moving around each other in the small space with the unconscious choreography of people learning to share their lives. But it was during their 3rd week that Abigail truly surprised her husband. They were returning from checking the southern trap line when they encountered fresh deer sign, tracks so recent. The morning dew hadn't settled in them yet. Silas motioned for quiet, reaching slowly for his rifle. The deer, a young buck, grazed in a meadow 50 yards ahead, unaware of their presence. Silas raised his weapon, took careful aim, then felt a gentle hand on his arm. He looked at Abigail questioningly. Wait, she whispered, so softly he could barely hear. Look at the wind direction. She was right. The slight breeze was carrying their scent directly toward the deer, which would spook before he could get a clean shot. Silas lowered his rifle and smiled at his wife with genuine admiration. In 3 weeks, she had learned to read conditions that took most people years to notice. They circled downwind, moving with the patient stealth that successful hunting required. This time, when Silas took aim, the shot was clean and quick. The deer dropped without suffering, and they had meat for the next 2 weeks. "Good eye," Silas said as they approached their prize. "You may have saved us hours of tracking a wounded animal." "I had an excellent teacher," Abigail replied, but he could see the pride in her accomplishment. As they worked together to field dress the deer, Abigail proved she had been paying attention to more than just tracking skills. Her knife work was careful but confident, and she showed none of the squeamishness that many people felt when confronting the reality of where their food came from. "Where did you learn to handle a blade like that?" Silas asked, impressed by her. "Technique. Years of preparing chickens and helping with butchering at the store," she said matter-of-factly. "Death is part of life, especially on the frontier. I see no point in being delicate about necessities." It was a practical philosophy that Silas appreciated, and another indication that his wife was far more resilient than anyone in town had imagined. As they worked side by side in the mountain meadow, he found himself genuinely grateful for her partnership. The gratitude deepened that evening, when Abigail prepared their venison dinner with herbs and techniques that transformed simple meat into something approaching restaurant quality. She had been observing his cooking methods and improving on them, adding touches of flavor and presentation that made their meals something to anticipate rather than simply endure. "This is remarkable," Silas said, savoring the perfectly seasoned steak. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother's recipe book," Abigail said, gesturing toward the leather-bound volume that had earned a place of honor on the kitchen shelf. She wrote down more than just ingredients and measurements. She included notes about techniques, substitutions, ways to make simple food special. Silas had noticed the book, but hadn't realized its significance. "May I look at it?" Abigail hesitated. For a moment, then fetched the volume and handed it to him. "It's more than recipes. Mother used it as a kind of diary, too. Her thoughts about life, marriage, raising children. It's very personal." As Silas carefully turned the pages, he began to understand why the book meant so much to his wife. Between recipes for cornbread and instructions for preserving meat, her mother had written observations about human nature, advice for difficult situations, and small philosophies about living a meaningful life. "A marriage is like bread," read one entry. "It requires the right ingredients, proper attention, and time to rise. But most importantly, it needs warmth to become what it's meant to be." Another page noted, "Judge people not by their first reaction to hardship, but by how they choose to adapt and grow." "Your mother was a wise woman," Silas said, closing the book carefully. "I can see where you learned your strength." "And my stubbornness," Abigail added with a smile. "She always said that a woman needed to be twice as capable as a man to be considered half as valuable, so she made sure I could do anything that needed doing." That philosophy was evident in everything Abigail brought to their partnership. She approached mountain life not as a burden to be endured, but as a set of skills to be mastered. Within a month of their marriage, she could read weather signs, identify edible plants, track game, and handle a rifle with respectable accuracy. But it was her practical innovations that impressed Silas most. She devised a more efficient system for preserving meat, reorganized their supply storage to maximize space, and created a small garden plot that would provide fresh vegetables well into winter. Each improvement demonstrated not just adaptability, but genuine intelligence applied to the challenges of frontier living. "You're making me look like an amateur," Silas said one evening as they surveyed her latest project, a root cellar that would keep their vegetables fresh through the coldest months. "I'm building on what you already established," Abigail replied. "You created a foundation that works. I'm just adding some finishing touches." It was a diplomatic answer, but they both knew she was being modest. Her contributions were transforming their daily life from mere survival into something approaching comfort and prosperity. The transformation wasn't limited to practical matters. As they spent their evenings talking by the fire, Silas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years. His childhood in Ohio, the dreams he'd once held for a different kind of life, the experiences that had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains. In return, Abigail revealed her own history, the challenges of being an unmarried woman in a small town, her love of learning, her secret ambitions that had never found acceptable expression. "I used to imagine teaching school in a big city," she admitted one night as they worked together on equipment maintenance. "Boston or Philadelphia, where women could have careers and ideas weren't considered dangerous simply because they came from female minds." "What stopped you?" "Fear, mostly, and practical concerns. I had no money for travel, no connections in the cities, no way to support myself while looking for opportunities. It was easier to accept what was available than to risk everything pursuing what might be impossible." Silas understood that logic completely. He had made his own accommodations with impossibility, choosing isolation over the risk of disappointment or loss. But looking at his wife now, seeing the intelligence and capability she brought to their mountain life, he wondered what other dreams they might have both abandoned too easily. "It's not too late," he said quietly. "Out here you could teach if you wanted to. There are scattered families, children who need education. No school board to satisfy, no community expectations to limit what you could accomplish." The possibility hadn't occurred to Abigail, and she felt a flutter of excitement at the thought. "Would you mind? Having students coming and going, disrupting your peaceful existence?" Silas considered the question seriously. A month ago, the idea of strangers regularly visiting his carefully ordered solitude would have horrified him, but his definition of peace had shifted. It no longer meant silence and isolation. It meant the contentment that came from sharing his life with someone who understood and appreciated what he had built. "I think I'd like it," he said, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. This place was meant to be more than just a hiding spot. That night, as they prepared for bed, both Abigail and Silas felt the stirring of possibilities they hadn't dared to consider. Their marriage was becoming something neither had expected, not just a practical arrangement or escape from loneliness, but a partnership that enabled dreams they had individually abandoned. The hunting rifle Abigail had learned to handle represented more than her adaptation to mountain life. It symbolized her transformation from a woman who accepted limitations to one who acquired whatever skills she needed to build the life she wanted. Under Silas's patient instruction, she had become not just competent with the weapon, but genuinely skilled. "You're a natural shot," he told her after she consistently hit targets at increasingly difficult ranges. "Better than most men I've known." "It's like everything else," she replied, checking the rifle's sight alignment with the same careful attention she brought to all tasks. "Pay attention, practice regularly, and don't let anyone convince you that you can't learn something just because they think you shouldn't." As autumn deepened toward winter, their partnership deepened as well. They worked together with increasing efficiency, anticipated each other's needs, and developed the comfortable intimacy that comes from shared challenges and mutual respect. Most evenings found them by the fire, reading aloud from Silas's small library or discussing improvements for their property. The physical aspect of their marriage remained undefined. They still slept separately, still maintained careful boundaries. But there were moments of connection that hinted at deeper possibilities. When Abigail's hand brushed Silas's while they worked side by side. When he steadied her during a difficult river crossing and neither moved away immediately. When their conversations by firelight stretched late into the night, creating an intimacy of minds that made physical attraction seem both natural and inevitable. They were, without quite admitting it, falling in love. Not the passionate, dramatic love celebrated in novels, but the steady, practical love that grows between two people who discover they fit together better than either had dared to hope. The first snow arrived in early October, dusting the peaks with white and reminding both Silas and Abigail that winter preparation couldn't be delayed. But on the morning they discovered the hand-carved chess set on their kitchen table, thoughts of weather and survival temporarily faded. Silas had worked on the project in secret, carving during his solo hunting trips and hiding the pieces in his workshop. Each figure was crafted from different woods, the pawns from smooth river birch, the knights from dark walnut, the kings and queens from rare mountain cedar that he'd been saving for something special. The craftsmanship was exquisite, detailed, enough to reveal the individual character of each piece while maintaining the balanced proportions necessary for actual play. "When did you find time for this?" Abigail asked, running her fingers over the intricate carving of a bishop, marveling at the tiny details he'd included, the texture of robes, the expression on faces no larger than her thumbnail. "Evenings, mostly. After you went up to the loft." Silas watched her reaction carefully, uncertain whether his gesture would be welcomed or seen as presumptuous. "You mentioned that you played as a child. I thought you might enjoy having a set." What he didn't say was that creating the chess set had become his way of working through complicated feelings about their marriage. Each evening spent carving had been time spent thinking about this woman who had surprised him at every turn, who had transformed his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. "It's beautiful," Abigail said simply, but her voice carried emotion that made Silas's careful work feel worthwhile. "The most thoughtful gift I've ever received." They played their first game that evening after dinner, setting up the board on the table while wind whistled through the pine trees outside. Abigail proved to be a skilled and strategic player, approaching each move with the same careful consideration she brought to all aspects of mountain life. The game lasted nearly 2 hours, with both players deeply focused on the complex patterns. "Emerging on the board. Check," Abigail announced quietly, moving her queen into position to threaten Silas's king. He studied the board, impressed by the elegant trap she'd constructed over the previous dozen moves. "When did you learn to play this well?" "My father taught me when I was 8. He said chess would teach me to think several moves ahead, to see patterns and possibilities that others might miss. It became our special time together before he died." Silas found a defensive move that prolonged the game, but they both knew she had gained the winning advantage. "Your father was a wise man. Strategic thinking isn't just useful in chess." "No," Abigail agreed, contemplating her next move. "It's useful in marriage too, understanding that every decision affects the whole game, that patience often beats aggression, that sometimes the best move isn't the obvious one." She advanced her queen, placing Silas's king in checkmate. "Game," she said softly, then looked up to meet his eyes. "Thank you for this. Not just the chess set, but for seeing me clearly enough to know I'd appreciate it." The intimacy of the moment surprised them both. Here, in the lamplight of their mountain cabin, sharing a game that required both skill and trust, they had crossed another invisible threshold in their relationship. The chess set wasn't just a gift, it was recognition, acceptance, and perhaps the beginning of something deeper. Over the following weeks, their evening chess games became a cherished ritual. They were evenly matched players, each victory hard-fought and respected. More importantly, the games provided a framework for conversation that led them into increasingly personal territory. "Why did you really leave civilization?" Abigail asked, one evening during a particularly complex endgame. "I mean the real reason, not just frustration with social expectations." Silas moved his knight to block her advance, buying time to consider both his tactical position and how much truth he was willing to share. "I was engaged once. Her name was Margaret. She died of fever 3 weeks before our wedding." The simple statement carried weight that made Abigail pause in her own strategic planning. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. It was. But what came after was worse. The sympathy, the advice, the well-meaning people who insisted I should move on, find someone else, accept that tragedy was part of life. They meant well, but they couldn't understand that I didn't want to risk that kind of loss again. Abigail studied the chessboard, but her mind was focused on this glimpse into her husband's heart. So you came to the mountains to avoid the possibility of caring that much about someone again. That was the plan. Silas met her eyes across the board. It was a good plan for 15 years. What changed? He moved his queen, a bold gambit that opened new possibilities while accepting considerable risk. I met a woman brave enough to marry a stranger, smart enough to master mountain life in a month, and stubborn enough to beat me at chess. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. Are you saying your plan failed? Completely. His smile carried affection and rueful humor. I find myself caring very much about what happens to you, Mrs. McGraw, more than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone. It was the closest either had come to speaking directly about the feelings developing between them. Abigail felt her heart racing as she contemplated her response, both to his emotional honesty and to his aggressive chess move. Good, she said, finally advancing her own queen to capture his. Because I've grown rather fond of you too, Mr. McGraw. Checkmate. November brought the serious cold and their first real test as a married couple facing winter isolation. Snow blocked the mountain passes, cutting them off from town and forcing them to depend entirely on their preparations and each other. For Abigail, who had never experienced such complete isolation, the adjustment required mental strength as much as physical endurance. The short days and long nights created an intimacy that surprised them both. With outside work limited by weather, they spent hours by the fire, talking about everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about the nature of happiness. Silas shared stories from his years of solitude, while Abigail revealed dreams and ambitions she'd never spoken aloud. I used to imagine writing a book, she admitted one evening, as they worked on their respective crafts. She was knitting warm socks while he repaired trap springs. Nothing grand or literary, just practical advice for women facing difficult circumstances. How to manage a household on limited resources, how to handle men who underestimate your abilities, how to find contentment when society offers you few choices. Why don't you write it now? Who would publish such a thing? And who would read it? Silas set down his tools and looked at his wife seriously. Women like you, facing the same challenges you've faced. There are more of them than you might think. Frontier, wives, widows managing farms alone, daughters trying to care for aging parents. They could benefit from your insights. The possibility had genuine appeal for Abigail, who had always enjoyed writing letters and keeping detailed records. I wouldn't know where to start. Start with what you know. Your mother's recipe book isn't just about cooking. It's about creating a home, building a life, finding ways to nurture others, even when resources are scarce. Your book could be similar, but broader. That night, Abigail lay in the loft considering Silas's suggestion, the idea of writing something useful, something that might help other women navigate the challenges she'd faced, excited her in a way she hadn't felt since childhood dreams of teaching. More importantly, her husband had not only listened to her ambition, but encouraged it, seeing possibilities where she had assumed only obstacles existed. Their physical relationship remained undefined, but was clearly evolving. The accidental touches had become more frequent and lingered longer. When Abigail climbed down from the loft each morning, Silas had begun greeting her with a gentle kiss on the forehead, a gesture so natural it seemed to surprise them both. When they worked side by side, their movements had developed an unconscious synchronization that spoke of deep comfort with each other's presence. One particularly cold night in late November, Abigail descended from the loft to find Silas still awake, sitting by the fire with his journal. She had intended to get a drink of water and return to bed, but something in his posture suggested he was troubled. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Too much thinking," he admitted. "Winter always makes me reflective." Abigail wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and joined him by the fire. "What kind of thinking?" Silas considered how much to share, then decided that honesty had served their relationship well so far. "I was remembering what it was like to spend winter alone. The silence, the way days would pass without speaking aloud, the feeling that I was the only person in the world. Do you miss it?" "No," he said without hesitation. "That's what troubles me. I built this life deliberately, convinced myself that solitude was safety, that independence was strength. Now I can't imagine going back to it." Abigail understood the vulnerability in his admission. "Are you afraid I'll leave?" "I'm afraid I'll lose you somehow. Death, accident, a dozen different ways the mountains can take what matters to you. I'm afraid of caring this much again." She reached over and took his hand, calloused from years of hard work, but gentle when it touched her skin. "Silas, look at me." He met her eyes in the firelight, seeing compassion and strength in equal measure. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I chose this life, chose you, and I don't make such decisions lightly. We're partners in this, the risks and the rewards both. Even if those risks include falling in love with a mountain man who doesn't deserve you." The question hung between them like smoke from the fire, carrying implications that neither could ignore. Abigail felt her heart racing as she realized they had finally reached the conversation that had been building for months. "Especially then," she said softly, "because I'm already halfway there myself, and I've discovered that love shared is stronger than love hoarded in safety." Silas brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Abigail, I know," she interrupted gently. "I feel it too. We don't have to rush anything, but we don't have to pretend it isn't happening either." They sat by the fire for another hour, holding hands and talking quietly about their hopes and fears for the future. When they finally went to bed, still in separate sleeping areas, but with acknowledged feelings between them, both felt that their marriage had crossed into territory that was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. The hand-carved chess set sat on the table, pieces arranged for their next game, a tangible symbol of Silas's growing affection and recognition of his wife's intelligence. Each carefully crafted figure represented hours of thought and care, a love letter written in wood by a man who was learning to express feelings he'd kept buried for 15 years. December brought blizzards that tested both the cabin's construction and the couple's growing bond. During one particularly fierce storm, Abigail began keeping a journal, not the practical record-keeping she'd always done, but something more personal and reflective. She wrote about the transformation of her marriage, the unexpected joy of finding partnership with a man who saw her clearly, and the growing certainty that what had begun as a desperate gamble was becoming the foundation of genuine happiness. Issue leather-bound book became her confidant during the long winter evenings when Silas was occupied with equipment maintenance or when she simply needed to process the remarkable changes in her life. Unlike her mother's recipe book, which offered wisdom from the past, Abigail's journal captured the daily miracle of two people learning to love each other against considerable odds. "Today, Silas taught me to read animal tracks in fresh snow," she wrote by lamplight while her husband dozed by the fire. "But more than that, he listened when I suggested modifications to his trap placement based on patterns I'd observed. 6 months ago, I was the woman people pitied. Tonight, I'm the equal partner of a man who values my mind as much as my companionship. The transformation feels like waking up from a dream I didn't realize I was having." The journal entries chronicled not just her internal transformation, but the evolution of their physical relationship. The morning kisses on the forehead had progressed to gentle embraces when one of them returned from outdoor chores. Their hands found each other naturally now during evening conversations. Most significantly, they had begun the delicate dance of increasing intimacy. Lingering glances, casual touches that carried unmistakable warmth, moments when the air between them seemed charged with possibility. It was during the third week of December that their careful boundaries finally shifted. Abigail woke in the loft to unusual sounds from below. Not the normal routine of morning preparation, but the restless movements of someone in discomfort. She descended the ladder to find Silas hunched over the kitchen table, clearly struggling with pain in his left shoulder. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned. "Old injury," he said through gritted teeth. "Took a fall from a horse about 5 years back. Cold weather sometimes makes it flare up." Without hesitation, Abigail moved behind him and began examining the affected area with gentle but knowledgeable fingers. Years of helping her mother care for injured neighbors had taught her basic techniques for dealing with muscle and joint problems. "May I?" she asked, her hands poised over his shoulders. Silas nodded, too uncomfortable to maintain the careful physical distance they'd preserved for months. When Abigail began working on the tight muscles, applying pressure with practiced skill, I couldn't suppress a groan of relief. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, as her strong hands found exactly the right spots to ease his discomfort. "My mother. She said women needed to understand bodies, how to birth babies, treat injuries, ease suffering. Knowledge like that makes you valuable in any community." As she worked, Abigail became aware of the intimacy of the situation. She was touching her husband with healing intent, her hands learning the landscape of his shoulders and back, feeling the scars that told the story of his mountain years. Silas, meanwhile, was experiencing not just physical relief, but the profound comfort of being cared for by someone who understood both his strength and his vulnerabilities. "Better?" she asked after several minutes of careful massage. "Much," he said, rotating his shoulder experimentally. "Thank you." When he turned to face her, they were standing closer than they had ever been, her hands still resting lightly on his arms. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. "Abigail," Silas said softly, his voice carrying question and invitation in equal measure. Instead of answering with words, she stepped closer and rose on her toes to kiss him. Not the chaste pecks they had exchanged, but a real kiss that acknowledged the feelings they had been carefully nurturing. Silas responded with surprise and growing warmth, his arms encircling her, as they finally allowed themselves to express what had been building for months. When they separated, both were breathing unevenly and looking at each other with new awareness. "I should probably mention," Abigail said with a slight smile, "that I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "Good," Silas replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because I've been wanting you to." The day passed with a new undercurrent of awareness between them. They went about their usual routines, checking supplies, maintaining equipment, preparing meals, but with frequent glances and touches that confirmed their relationship had entered new territory. Neither rushed to define what had changed, but both felt the shift like a warm current beneath the surface of their daily life. That evening, as they sat by the fire playing chess, the familiar ritual felt different. The game had always been intellectually engaging, but now it carried an additional charge of attraction and affection. When Abigail captured one of Silas's pieces, he found himself more interested in watching her face than in planning his counterattack. When Silas made a particularly clever move, Abigail felt a flush of pride in her husband's strategic mind that had nothing to do with competition and everything to do with growing love. "You're distracted tonight," she observed, as he made an uncharacteristically weak defensive move. "Can you blame me?" he replied, meeting her eyes across the board. "I'm sitting across from my wife, who happens to be beautiful, brilliant, and brave enough to have married me sight unseen. Chess seems less important than it did this morning." Abigail felt warmth spread through her at his words. "Flattery won't save your king," she said, but her tone was affectionate rather than competitive. "I'm not trying to save my king," Silas said quietly. "I'm trying to tell my queen that I'm falling in love with her." The chess piece Abigail had been holding slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the board and disrupting their carefully planned game. But neither of them cared about the scattered pieces. They had finally spoken the words that had been growing between them like a secret garden, carefully tended but not yet acknowledged. "Are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Completely," Silas said without hesitation, "utterly and entirely in love with the woman who agreed to marry a stranger and turned out to be everything I never knew I was looking for." Abigail rose from her chair and moved around the table, chess forgotten. When she reached Silas, he stood to meet her, and they came together in an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. "I love you too," she whispered against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see me clearly and value what you see." They held each other by the fire, two people who had begun as strangers, brought together by a cruel bet, and discovered that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Outside, the winter wind howled through the mountains, but inside their cabin, surrounded by the life they had built together, they had found warmth that had nothing to do with the flames in the fireplace. Later that night, for the first time since their wedding, they went to bed together. Not in passion, but in the tender intimacy of two people who had finally admitted their feelings and wanted simply to hold each other through the long winter night. They lay talking quietly in the darkness, sharing dreams and fears, past sorrows, and future hopes. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a drunken bet," Silas said, as Abigail settled against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd be brave enough to say yes to one," she replied. "But I'm glad I was. Whatever brought us together, we've made something real out of it." As they drifted towards sleep, Abigail's journal lay open on the table, the last entry capturing the day's significance in her careful handwriting. "Today I learned that love doesn't always begin with attraction or passion. Sometimes it begins with respect and grows through shared challenges, careful attention, and the courage to be vulnerable with another person. Today, my marriage became something I had given up hoping for, a true partnership of hearts and minds." The final words, on the page, added just before she joined Silas in their shared bed, read simply, "I am at last completely happy." Outside, the mountain winter continued its ancient rhythm. But inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully in each other's arms, protected by love they had built one careful day at a time. Spring arrived, late in the mountains that year, but by early April the snow had melted enough for travel between the high country and Cedar Falls. Silas and Abigail made their first trip to town since the previous autumn, both curious to see how their marriage was perceived after a winter of isolation and eager to replenish supplies that couldn't be produced or hunted. The reception they received surprised everyone, including themselves. Instead of the cruel jokes and skeptical whispers they expected, they found genuine respect for what they had accomplished. Abigail's transformation was visible. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had mastered difficult challenges, while Silas seemed more at ease in social situations than anyone could remember. "You both look well," Martha Henderson observed, as she helped them select fabric and supplies. "Mountain life agrees with you." "We've been fortunate," Abigail replied diplomatically, though she couldn't entirely suppress her smile. The truth was that she had never been happier, and it showed in everything, from her posture to the way she and Silas moved together with unconscious synchronization. They were loading their purchases into the wagon when a rider approached from the east, a tall, hard-looking man on a lathered horse who clearly had been traveling fast. He dismounted outside Murphy's saloon and immediately began questioning the locals about recent arrivals and long-time residents. Something about the stranger's manner set off alarms in Silas's mind. The way he carried himself, the way his eyes catalogued potential threats and escape routes, the professional efficiency of his questions, all of it spoke of someone accustomed to violence and pursuit. "We should go," Silas said quietly to his wife, but it was already too late. The stranger had spotted them and was approaching with the purposeful stride of a man who had found what he was looking for. Up close, his face showed the weathered hardness of someone who lived by the gun, and the badge pinned to his vest identified him as a U.S. Marshal. "Silas McGraw?" the Marshal asked, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "That's right," Silas replied carefully, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail without making it obvious. "Marshal Jake Brennan, Federal Territory Enforcement. I need to ask you some questions about events in Colorado Territory, approximately 16 years ago." The blood drained from Silas's face, and Abigail felt her husband's entire body tense beside her. Whatever this was about, it connected to the past he had tried to leave behind in the mountains. "I think there's been some mistake, Marshal," Silas said evenly. "I've been living quietly in these mountains for 15 years. Haven't been to Colorado in longer than that." Brennan's smile was cold and knowing. "That's interesting, because I have it on good authority that you were Deputy U.S. Marshal Silas McGraw, stationed out of Denver, until you disappeared in 1831, after a particular unpleasant incident involving the Comanche Creek Gang." The words hit the small crowd that had gathered like a physical blow. Silas McGraw, their local mountain man, the hermit who traded pelts and avoided civilization, had been a federal lawman. The revelation changed everything about how they saw him and about the danger that his presence might bring to their small community. Abigail stared at her husband, seeing him suddenly as a stranger. Everything she thought she knew about his past, about his reasons for choosing isolation, had been built on incomplete information. Who was this man she had married and fallen in love with? "The incident at Comanche Creek," Brennan continued, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having. 6 marshals dead, including your partner. $50,000 in stolen gold, never recovered. And Deputy Silas McGraw vanished without a trace, presumed dead. "Because I was nearly dead," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying pain that had nothing to do with present circumstances. "Frank Harrison was my partner and my friend. I didn't run from that fight. I barely crawled away from it. Crawled away with the gold, according to some folks. That's why I'm here, McGraw. The Comanche Creek Gang has been broken up, most of them dead or captured. But the gold was never found, and there are people who think you might know where it ended up." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Everyone in the small crowd was staring at Silas with new eyes, wondering if the quiet mountain man they thought they knew was actually a corrupt federal marshal who had stolen a fortune and disappeared into the wilderness. Abigail felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The man she loved, the husband who had shown her nothing but honesty and kindness, apparently had a secret history that involved violence, betrayal, and murder. How much of what she thought she knew about him was real, and how much was carefully constructed fiction? "The gold was never stolen by any lawman," Silas said, his voice gaining strength. "It was lost when the gang ambushed our patrol. 6 good men died protecting it, and it went over a cliff with half the horses when we tried to retreat. I spent 3 days buried under dead bodies and horse carcasses before I could dig my way out." "Convenient story," Brennan observed. "Harder to prove. After 16 years. "I can prove it," Silas said suddenly. "The gold, the ambush site, all of it. If that's what this is about, I can take you there and show you exactly what happened." Brennan's interest sharpened visibly. "Now that's an interesting offer. You willing to do that? If it clears my name and gets you away from my family." "Yes." It was the first time Silas had referred to Abigail as family in public, and despite her confusion and growing fear, she felt a flutter of warmth at the word. Whatever secrets her husband carried, his feelings for her were genuine. "There's just one problem with your generous offer," Brennan said, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "The Comanche Creek Gang isn't as broken up as I led you to believe. In fact, the 3 surviving members escaped from territorial prison 2 months ago, and according to this wanted poster, They're heading this way. He unfolded the paper to reveal crude but recognizable drawings of three dangerous-looking men, along with descriptions of their crimes and a substantial bounty for their capture. At the bottom, in official script, was a warning that they were considered extremely dangerous and likely to kill anyone who stood between them and their objectives. What objectives? Silas asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Why, finding you, of course, and recovering the gold they're convinced you stole from them. They've been tracking stories about a mysterious mountain. A man in Montana territory who matches your description should be here any day now. The implications hit everyone at once. Cedar Falls, a peaceful frontier community that rarely saw violence more serious than Saturday night brawls, was about to become the focal point of a confrontation between hardened criminals and whatever version of Silas McGraw would emerge when his past finally caught up with him. You need to evacuate the town, Silas said immediately. Get everyone to safety before they arrive. Can't do that, Brennan replied. These men have been killing their way across 3 territories. This is my chance to end it, and I need bait to draw them in. The word bait sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She was beginning to understand that her husband's past was about to collide with their present in ways that could destroy everything they had built together. Marshall, she said, finding her voice despite her fear and confusion. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private? Brennan looked at her with new interest. Mrs. McGraw, isn't it? The famous bet that became a marriage. You might want to reconsider your attachment to this man, ma'am. His past has a way of catching up with people around him. My attachment, Abigail said with quiet dignity, is based on the man I know, not on accusations about things that happened before we met. It was a statement of loyalty that cost her considerable effort, given how much her world had just been turned upside down. But whatever secrets Silas carried, whatever dangers might be approaching, he was still her husband and her partner. She would stand with him until she understood the full truth. Silas looked at his wife with gratitude and something approaching awe. Despite learning that he had been living under false pretenses, despite discovering that his past might bring deadly danger to her doorstep, she was choosing to trust him. It was more than he deserved and more than he had dared to hope for. There's something else you should know, Brennan said, clearly enjoying his revelations. The reason these men are so determined to find McGraw isn't just about the gold. It's personal. The leader of what's left of the gang is Thomas Brennan, my brother. The final revelation fell into place like the last piece of a deadly puzzle. This wasn't just about law enforcement or recovering stolen money. It was about family loyalty, revenge, and settling old scores that had been festering for 16 years. Your brother? Silas asked. Thomas always believed you were the one who sold them out, who knew exactly when and where they'd be moving the gold. When the ambush went wrong and you disappeared, he was convinced you had double-crossed everyone, the gang and your fellow marshals, and made off with the fortune. That's insane. Why would I sacrifice my partner and 5 other good men for money? Because according to Thomas, you weren't always the honorable lawman you pretended to be. He claims you had been feeding information to the gang for months, that you were supposed to be their inside man, but got greedy and decided to take everything for yourself. Abigail listened to these accusations with growing horror. If any of it was true, the man she loved was not just a former lawman with a tragic past, but a corrupt officer who had betrayed his oath and caused the deaths of innocent men. The thought made her physically sick, but she forced herself to remain steady and alert. None of that is true, Silas said flatly, but I can see why your brother might believe it. The ambush was perfectly timed, as if someone had told them exactly when we'd be most vulnerable, but it wasn't me. Then who? I spent 16 years in these mountains asking myself that same question, and I finally figured out the answer about 5 years ago, when I overheard some trappers talking about a territorial judge who'd been secretly working with outlaw gangs. Brennan's expression shifted slightly. What judge? Judge Marcus Whitfield. He was the one who set the schedule for gold shipments, who knew the routes and timing. He was also the one who convinced the territorial governor to send a small escort, instead of a full cavalry unit, said it would be more discreet. Whitfield died 3 years ago. I know. But before he died, he confessed to his involvement with several criminal enterprises. The information is in the territorial records in... Helena, if you care to look. Marshal Brennan studied Silas carefully, weighing this new information against his brother's long-held beliefs about what had happened at Comanche Creek. If McGraw was telling the truth, then Thomas had spent 16 years pursuing the wrong man for the wrong reasons. Even if you're innocent of theft and betrayal, Brennan said finally, that doesn't change the immediate problem. My brother and his men are coming here. They believe you have their gold, and they're going to tear this town apart looking for it. Abigail stepped closer to her husband, taking his arm in a gesture of support that surprised everyone watching. Then we'd better prepare for them, she said calmly. All of us. The hidden truth was finally emerging, but instead of providing resolution, it had created new dangers that threatened not just Silas and Abigail's marriage, but the entire community that had witnessed their unlikely love story. The mountain man's past was about to collide with his present in ways that would test every bond he had formed and every truth he held dear. That evening, in the privacy of their cabin, the full weight of the day's revelations settled between Silas and Abigail like a physical presence. They had ridden home in relative silence, both processing the fundamental shift in their understanding of their marriage and their future. Now, sitting across from each other at their small table, where they had shared so many peaceful meals and chess games, they faced the most important conversation of their relationship. Silas reached into a hidden compartment behind the stone fireplace, retrieving a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of metal. From it he withdrew a U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished with age but unmistakably authentic. The 5-pointed star seemed to catch the lamplight, reflecting their faces in its worn surface. "This is who I was," he said quietly, setting the badge on the table between them. Deputy U.S. Marshal Silas McGraw, commissioned in 1829, missing and presumed dead after the Comanche Creek incident in 1831. Abigail stared at the badge, trying to reconcile this tangible proof of her husband's hidden identity with the mountain man she thought she knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I buried that man in these mountains 16 years ago. Because I convinced myself that Silas McGraw, the lawman, died with his partner and his faith in justice. Because I was afraid that if you knew what I had, then you'd see me as someone who abandoned his duty instead of someone who chose a different path." "But you didn't abandon it," Abigail said, beginning to understand. "You've been hiding from it." Silas nodded, the admission clearly painful. "After Frank died, after watching good men get slaughtered because someone sold us out, I couldn't stomach the idea of pinning on that badge again. Every time I looked at it, I saw their faces, heard their voices. I came to these mountains to escape the guilt and the grief. And now it's followed you home. Now it's put you in danger. That's the part I can't forgive myself for." Abigail reached across the table and picked up the marshal's badge, feeling its weight and examining the intricate engraving. "This represents justice, doesn't it? Protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. That's what I used to believe. And you stopped believing it because corrupt men perverted the system you served." Silas looked at his wife with surprise. Her questions were leading him to consider his past from angles he had avoided for 16 years. "I suppose I did. Then you let the wrong people win," Abigail said gently but firmly. "If Thomas Brennan and his gang are coming here to terrorize innocent people because they believe a lie about you, then running away again won't stop them. It will just make you complicit in whatever they do to this community." The words hit Silas like physical blows because he recognized their truth. He had spent 16 years telling himself that he was choosing peace over violence, solitude over responsibility. But in reality, he had been choosing cowardice over courage, abandoning his principles instead of fighting for them. Abigail, you don't understand what these men are capable of. They've killed territorial marshals, robbed banks, burned homesteads with families inside. If they come here and I'm not what they're looking for, if they don't believe me about the gold, they'll take their frustration out on anyone they can reach. Then we make sure they believe you, she said matter-of-factly. You said you could prove what really happened at Comanche Creek. We do that. We? Silas stared at his wife in alarm. Abigail, you're not going to be anywhere near this confrontation. I'll take you to Helena or Great Falls, somewhere safe. No. The firmness in her voice stopped him mid-sentence. I married you for better or worse, remember? I'm not running away just because worse has arrived. This isn't about marriage vows. It's about survival. These men won't hesitate to kill you to get to me. Abigail stood and moved to their bedroom area, returning with something Silas hadn't seen in months, the rifle he had taught her to use, cleaned and loaded with the competence he had taught her. She set it on the table beside the marshal's badge. Then, we make sure they don't get the chance, she said calmly. You've trained me well, husband. I can shoot, I can track. I know this terrain as well as you do now. More importantly, I know you. The man I married has honor and courage, even if he's forgotten it temporarily. Silas felt something shift in his chest as he looked at his wife, truly looked at her. Here was a woman who had transformed herself from a town shopkeeper to a mountain. Woman in less than a year, who had faced every challenge with determination and grace. Now she was volunteering to stand with him against killers who had nothing to lose, not because she was naive about the danger, but because she understood that some fights were worth the risk. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. Probably not. Abigail replied with a slight smile. But you have me anyway, and I have plans for our future that don't include letting outlaws destroy what we've built. Over the next 2 days, they prepared for a confrontation that seemed both inevitable and surreal. Silas retrieved weapons he had hidden throughout the cabin, extra rifles, ammunition, even a shotgun he had modified for close-range defense. His movements as he checked and cleaned the weapons were those of a professional lawman, revealing skills that had been dormant but not forgotten. Abigail proved equally practical in her preparations. She organized their medical supplies, prepared food that could be eaten quickly during a siege, and helped Silas plan defensive positions around their property. Most importantly, she insisted on understanding every detail of the Comanche Creek incident, studying it with the same systematic approach she had once applied to inventory management. Walk me through it again, she said on their second evening of preparation. The ambush, the missing gold, everything. Silas spread a rough map on their table, marking locations with chess pieces from their handmade set. We were transporting 50,000 in gold coins from the Denver Mint to the territorial capital, 6 marshals, 12 pack horses, traveling. What was supposed to be a secure route through the mountains. He moved pieces across the paper, recreating the fatal journey. Judge Whitfield had insisted on a small escort, said a larger group would attract attention. He also chose the route and timing. We should have been suspicious, but we trusted the system. Where did the ambush happen? Silas placed a black chess piece at a narrow canyon marked on his map. Here, Comanche Creek Canyon, about 40 miles southeast of here. Perfect place for it. Narrow passage, high walls on both sides, no escape routes. The gang had positioned themselves above us and opened fire without warning. And the gold. When the shooting started, our pack train panicked. Half the horses went over the edge, taking the gold with them. Frank and I tried to hold the canyon mouth to give the others a chance to retreat, but we were outnumbered 3-1. Abigail studied the map carefully. The gold went over this cliff, into the river below. The current there is fast and deep, flows into underground caves. Even if someone survived to look for it, they'd never find it all. But some could be recovered. Silas nodded reluctantly. Probably some of it. The gang must have retrieved what they could, but they'd have needed weeks to search properly. When I crawled out 3 days later, they were long gone. So there might actually be gold still down there. Abigail, what are you thinking? She looked up from the map with the expression he had learned to recognize. His wife had an idea, and it was probably both brilliant and dangerous. I'm thinking that if Thomas Brennan and his men are coming here because they believe you have their gold, maybe we should give them what they want. We don't have the gold. No, but we know where it is, and more importantly, we know something they don't. That recovering it would prove your innocence and their dead comrade's stupidity. Silas began to understand her reasoning. You want to lead them to Comanche Creek. I want to end this properly. Not with more violence and more deaths, but by exposing the truth. If we can prove what really happened, show them the gold where it fell, maybe we can convince them that you're not their enemy. And if we can't, convince them? Abigail picked up her rifle and checked the action with movements that had become second nature. Then we deal with them the way the frontier deals with men who threaten innocent people. The plan they developed over the next day was audacious and risky, but it had the advantage of moving the confrontation away from Cedar Falls and onto ground that Silas knew intimately. They would wait for the gang to arrive, then offer to lead them to the actual site where the gold had been lost. If the men could be convinced by evidence, the matter might end peacefully. If not, the canyon would provide a better battlefield than the open spaces around town. Marshal Brennan, when they presented the plan to him, was skeptical but intrigued. You're talking about walking into a trap, he pointed out. These men have every reason to kill you once they see there's no easy way to recover the gold. Maybe, Silas agreed, but they also have 16 years of wondering what really happened to their partners and their money. Sometimes the truth is powerful enough to overcome even old hatred. And if it's not, then you'll have 3 dangerous criminals isolated in a canyon 40 miles from the nearest innocent bystanders. Brennan considered the plan for several minutes before nodding slowly. It's insane enough that it might work, but I go with you. No, Abigail said firmly. 3 people they might believe are negotiating in good faith. 4 people looks like an ambush. Mrs. McGraw, these are hardened killers who have been chasing ghosts for 16 years, she interrupted. They deserve to learn the truth, even if they don't deserve to live through it. On their final evening, before the expected arrival of the gang, Silas and Abigail sat by their fire sharing what might be their last peaceful moment together. The marshal's badge sat on the table between them, no longer a symbol of shame, but a reminder of duties that transcended personal safety. I need to tell you something, Silas said as they prepared for bed. Before this started, I was planning to ask if you wanted to move to Helena. Start fresh somewhere with more opportunities. Maybe that school you talked about. And now I realize that running from problems doesn't solve them. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? The courage to be the man I was meant to be. Abigail leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the steady strength that had first attracted her to him. Promise me something, anything. Promise that if we survive this, you'll consider putting that badge back on. Not here necessarily, but somewhere. The frontier needs lawmen who understand justice, not just violence. Silas looked down at his wife, marveling once again at her ability to see possibilities where he saw only problems. If we survive this, I promise to consider it. Outside their cabin, the mountain night seemed heavier than usual, as if the very air was holding its breath. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that had been 16 years in the making, and 2 people who had found love against impossible odds would discover whether their bond was strong enough to survive the collision between past and present. The marshals. Badge caught the firelight one last time before Silas carefully wrapped it in cloth and placed it in his shirt pocket over his heart. Tomorrow, He would either reclaim his identity as a lawman or die trying to protect the woman who had shown him that love was worth any risk. They arrived at dawn. 3 hard men on horses pushed to exhaustion, their eyes holding the desperate fury of people who had been running for too long. Thomas Brennan bore a strong resemblance to his martial brother, but where Jake Brennan carried himself with professional authority, Thomas moved with the predatory wariness of someone who trusted no one and expected betrayal from every direction. Silas and Abigail watched from the tree line as the outlaws approached their cabin, noting the way they positioned themselves to cover multiple escape routes and kept their weapons ready for immediate use. These were not men who had come to negotiate. They had come to collect what they believed was owed to them, regardless of the cost. McGraw. Thomas Brennan's voice carried clearly across the mountain meadow. I know you're out there. Time to settle accounts. Silas stepped into the open, his hands visible but near his weapons. Abigail remained in the trees with her rifle, positioned to provide covering fire if the situation deteriorated quickly. They had practiced this approach, but facing armed killers was different from preparing for the possibility. Thomas Brennan, Silas called back, been a long time. 16 years, you thieving bastard. 16 years of wondering where you hid our gold. Your gold. Silas walked carefully closer, noting the positions of all 3 men. That was federal money being transported under lawful authority. Your gang murdered 6 good men trying to steal it. Thomas laughed bitterly. Don't play innocent with me. McGraw, we know you were feeding us information about shipments and schedules. The Comanche Creek job was supposed to be easy because you'd arranged for minimal escort and maximum payoff. I never gave you information about anything, but I know who did. The statement clearly surprised Thomas, who had spent 16 years certain of McGraw's guilt. What are you talking about? Judge Marcus Whitfield was your inside man, not me. He's the one who set up the shipment schedule, chose the route, and convinced the territorial governor to send a small escort. He confessed to it before he died. 3 years ago. That's a lie. It's in the territorial records in Helena. You can check for yourself if you live long enough. One of Thomas's companions, a scarred man with nervous eyes, shifted his grip on his rifle. Tom, what if he's telling the truth? What if we've been chasing the wrong man all these years? Shut up, Kowalski, Thomas snarled. He's just trying to save his skin. Silas took another step forward, gambling that curiosity might overcome bloodlust. I can prove what really happened at Comanche Creek. I can show you where your precious gold actually ended up. More lies. No lies. The gold went over the cliff when our pack train panicked during the ambush. Most of it's still down there in the river. If you want to see for yourself, I'll take you to the exact spot. Thomas studied Silas's face, looking for signs of deception. After 16 years of certainty about McGraw's guilt, the possibility that he had been wrong was both appealing and terrifying. If McGraw was innocent, then everything Thomas had done in pursuit of revenge had been pointless. Why would you do that? Thomas asked suspiciously. Why help us find gold that could make us rich? Because I'm tired of running from something I didn't do. Because I want to clear my name and get on with my life. And because if you see the truth with your own eyes, maybe you'll finally accept that I never betrayed anyone. From her concealed position, Abigail watched the exchange with growing tension. She could see that Thomas Brennan was wavering, torn, between years of hatred and the possibility of finally learning what had really happened to his companions and their intended fortune. But she could also see that his 2 remaining gang members were getting restless, eager for action, regardless of the truth. The scarred man, Kowalski, was fingering his trigger guard nervously. The 3rd man, heavy-set and mean-looking, kept glancing toward the cabin, as if wondering what treasures might be hidden inside. These were not men accustomed to patience or nuanced thinking. Even if you're telling the truth about the judge, Thomas said slowly, that doesn't change the fact that you disappeared after the ambush. If you were innocent, why didn't you report back to your superiors? Because I spent 3 days unconscious under dead bodies and debris. By the time I dug myself out, I was more dead than alive. And when I finally made it back to Denver, I learned that the territorial authorities had already written off the entire patrol as killed in action. Silas unbuttoned his shirt, revealing scars that crisscrossed his chest and shoulders, the permanent reminders of the Comanche Creek ambush. I took 2 bullets and got trampled by panicked horses. I should have died with the rest of my patrol. The evidence was convincing, but Thomas had built his identity around the belief that McGraw was responsible for his brother's deaths. Accepting the truth would mean admitting that 16 years of his life had been wasted on a lie. You're asking me to believe that we've been hunting an innocent man, Thomas said, his voice carrying both anger and something approaching despair. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and decide for yourself. Come with me to Comanche Creek, see where the gold actually is. Judge for yourself whether I could have retrieved it and escaped while barely alive and on foot. The heavy-set gang member, clearly tired of talking, raised his rifle towards Silas. This is all very touching, Tom, but we didn't ride 300 miles to have a philosophical discussion. Let's just kill him and search his property. It was Abigail who responded to the threat. Her rifle cracked from the tree line, and the heavy man's weapon spun from his hands, his fingers numbed by the impact of her bullet against the gun's barrel. All 3 outlaws spun toward the sound, suddenly aware that they were not in complete control of the situation. That was a warning shot, Abigail called from her concealed position. The next one won't be. Who the hell is that? Kowalski demanded, scanning the trees for targets. My wife, Silas said with unmistakable pride, Mrs. Abigail McGraw, and she's a better shot than any of you. Thomas stared at Silas with new recognition. You got married. The hermit mountain man found himself. A woman. The woman found me, actually. Best thing that ever happened to me. For the first time since the confrontation began, something resembling human emotion flickered across Thomas Brennan's face. Perhaps it was the memory of his own lost loves, or recognition that even men he hated could find redemption through connection with another person. Bring her out here, Thomas ordered. I want to see the woman brave enough to marry the man I've been hunting for 16 years. Abigail emerged from the trees, her rifle held ready but not directly threatening. She walked to Silas's side with the calm confidence of a woman who had faced mountain winters and wilderness dangers, who was not easily intimidated by armed men with grudges. Mrs. McGraw, Thomas said, touching his hat brim in a gesture of respect that surprised everyone. Your husband tells quite a story about innocence and betrayal. You believe him? I know him, Abigail replied simply. I've lived with him, worked beside him, seen his character in situations where pretense would be impossible. He's many things, but he's not a liar or a thief. Even if that's true, he cost us our brothers, our freedom, our future. Someone has to pay for that. Then make the right person pay, Abigail said firmly. My husband has offered to show you the truth about what happened at Comanche Creek. If you're truly interested in justice rather than revenge, you'll accept his offer. The standoff stretched taut as Thomas weighed his options. He could order his men to open fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, with Mrs. McGraw positioned in the trees. He could retreat, but after 16 years of pursuit, walking away without resolution seemed impossible. Or he could gamble everything on McGraw's claim that the truth could be found at the original ambush site. All right, Thomas decided. We'll go to Comanche Creek. But understand this, McGraw. If this turns out to be some kind of trap, if you're leading us into an ambush, I'll kill your wife before I kill you. Silas felt cold rage wash through him at the threat, but he forced himself to remain calm. No traps, no ambushes, just the truth about what happened 16 years ago. As they prepared to leave for the journey to Comanche Creek Canyon, Abigail caught her husband's eye and saw something she recognized. The Marshal he had once been was emerging from behind the mountain man he had become. The confrontation was far from over, but at least they were moving it to ground where the truth could finally be revealed. The journey to Comanche Creek Canyon took them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory. Narrow mountain trails that wound between towering peaks, across rushing streams swollen with snowmelt, and through forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground below. They traveled in tense formation, Thomas and his men in front, Silas and Abigail following, everyone alert for signs of betrayal or ambush. As they rode, the landscape itself seemed to bear witness to the tragedy they were revisiting. Bleached bones of animals that had died in previous winters dotted the trail, and more than once they passed the ruins of abandoned cabins where earlier settlers had tried and failed to carve out a life in the unforgiving wilderness. It was late afternoon when they finally reached the rim of Comanche Creek Canyon. The sight that greeted them was both beautiful and ominous. A narrow gorge carved by centuries of water and wind, its walls rising hundreds of feet on both sides, the creek below rushing white and furious over rocks worn smooth by time. "This is it," Silas said quietly, dismounting near a cluster of weathered wooden crosses that marked graves. "This is where it happened." Thomas studied the terrain with the eye of someone who understood tactics and ambush sites. The canyon was indeed perfect for what his gang had attempted, narrow enough that a small party couldn't maneuver, deep enough that escape was nearly impossible, with elevated positions on both sides for shooters to control the entire passage. "Where were you positioned when the shooting started?" Thomas asked. Silas pointed to the canyon mouth. "Frank and I were riding point, about 50 yards ahead of the pack train. The shooting came from up there." He indicated rocky ledges on both sides of the canyon walls. "Your brothers had us in a perfect crossfire. And the gold? Follow me." They made their way down a precarious trail into the canyon itself, leading their horses carefully over loose rock and around obstacles that could easily cause a fatal fall. At the bottom, the sound of rushing water made conversation difficult, but the evidence of what had happened 16 years ago was still visible to those who knew what to look for. Scattered among the rocks were pieces of equipment that had survived. The years, a broken bridle, the remains of a pack saddle, even a few coins that had been wedged too tightly in crevices for the current to carry away. "The pack horses went over there," Silas said, pointing to where the trail narrowed and turned sharply beside the creek. "When the shooting started, they panicked and bolted. Half of them went right over the edge." Thomas examined the area carefully, noting the steep drop and the churning water below. If heavily laden pack animals had indeed gone over that precipice, recovering their cargo would have been nearly impossible, especially for men under fire and fighting for their lives. "How much of the gold went into the water?" he asked. "Most of it, maybe 40,000 of the 50. What your brothers recovered after the fight couldn't have been more than 10,000. Kowalski had been growing increasingly agitated during their exploration of the canyon. "This is all very interesting," he said, "but it doesn't change the fact that McGraw disappeared with federal money. Even if most of it went in the drink, he could still have made off with a fortune." "Look around, Kowalski," Abigail said sharply. "Does this look like a place where a wounded man could have conducted a treasure hunt? The current here would have scattered those coins for miles downstream." But Kowalski was past listening to reason. The long ride, the tension of the confrontation, and his own violent nature were combining to create a dangerous instability. "I'm tired of all this talk," he snarled, raising his rifle toward Silas. "Let's just finish what we came here to do." "Wait," Thomas ordered, but Kowalski was already squeezing the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, but Kowalski's target was no longer where he had been aiming. Silas had thrown himself sideways at the first sign of movement, tackling Abigail to the ground behind a large boulder as the bullet whined overhead. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of men who had learned violence in the hardest school. The heavy-set gang member, still nursing his injured hand from Abigail's earlier shot, tried to flank their position. Abigail rose from behind their cover just long enough to put a bullet through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him among the rocks. Silas, meanwhile, was moving with skills that had been dormant for 16 years, but not forgotten. He rolled behind another boulder, drew his sidearm, and put 2 quick shots into the rocky ledge where Kowalski was trying to find cover. The outlaw ducked reflexively, giving Silas the opening he needed to advance to a better position. "Enough!" Thomas shouted, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Kowalski, stand down. This isn't what we came here for." But Kowalski was beyond hearing orders or reason. He had spotted Abigail behind her boulder and was taking careful aim at the woman who had humiliated him earlier. His shot would have been fatal if not for the small mirror Abigail had brought, her mother's compact, which she had been using to signal Silas about enemy positions. The bullet struck the mirror just as she was angling it to reflect sunlight into Kowalski's eyes. The impact sending glass shards across her face and hands, but deflecting the shot enough to save her life. The distraction cost Kowalski everything. Silas's return shot took him center mass, dropping him permanently among the canyon rocks where his gang had once ambushed federal marshals. The echoes of gunfire faded, leaving only the sound of rushing water and labored breathing. The heavy-set gang member was alive, but badly wounded. Clutching his shoulder and moaning, Kowalski would never hurt anyone again. And Thomas Brennan found himself facing the truth he had been avoiding for 16 years. "You fight like a lawman," Thomas said quietly, his own weapon lowered, like someone trained to protect people, not rob them. Silas helped Abigail to her feet, checking the cuts on her face from the shattered mirror. "I was a lawman, Thomas, a good one, until the day your brothers tried to steal federal money and killed my partner in the process." Frank Harrison was. "Your partner?" "My partner and my friend. He died trying to protect that gold shipment, died believing in justice and the law. When I crawled out of this canyon 3 days later, I was so broken in body and spirit that I couldn't imagine ever wearing a badge again." Thomas stared at the scattered coins among the rocks, physical evidence that supported everything McGraw had claimed. Most of the gold was indeed gone, swept away by 16 years of spring floods and winter ice. What remained could be collected by one persistent man in a few hours, but it represented a fraction of the original treasure. "We got maybe 8,000 from what we could find after the fight," Thomas admitted. "Spent most of it staying ahead of the law. Been living hand to mouth ever since, always believing that you had made off with the real fortune." "The real fortune went over that cliff with good men who died protecting it," Silas said. "Just like I told you." From her position beside her husband, Abigail watched Thomas Brennan grapple with the collapse of everything he had believed for 16 years. His brothers had died not as victims of betrayal, but as criminals attempting theft. The man he had pursued across half the continent was innocent of the crimes he had attributed to him. And worst of all, the fortune that had motivated everything they had done was mostly lost to time and the elements. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying defeat and something approaching despair. Silas reached into his shirt and withdrew the marshal's badge he had carried to this confrontation. The tarnished metal caught the canyon light as he pinned it to his vest for the first time in 16 years. "Now you surrender to federal authority," he said quietly, "and I do my duty as a sworn officer of the territorial government. You're arresting me. I'm giving you the chance to surrender peacefully. You and your surviving friend there can stand trial for your crimes, or you can resist arrest and join Kowalski among these rocks. Your choice." Thomas looked at his wounded companion, then at the badge on McGraw's chest, then at the scattered evidence of his brother's fate. Everything he had done for 16 years had been based on a lie, and now he faced the consequences of that deception. His father's pocket watch, inherited when the old man died and carried through every job since, had been damaged in the gunfight. The case was dented where a bullet had struck it, the glass cracked, the mechanism probably destroyed. But it had absorbed enough of the impact to save his life, a final irony in a day full of revelations. "I surrender," Thomas said finally, dropping his weapons and raising his hands. "Federal Marshal McGraw, I surrender to your authority." As Silas placed Thomas Brennan and his wounded companion under arrest, using rope from their saddles to secure them for the journey back to civilization, Abigail felt a profound sense of completion. Her husband had not only cleared his name and confronted his past, but had reclaimed his identity as a protector of innocent people. The truth about Comanche Creek Canyon had finally been revealed, 16 years after the original tragedy. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally being served. And two people, who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, had proven that their bond was strong enough to survive the collision between past and present. The damaged pocket watch in Thomas Brennan's possession would serve as evidence of what had transpired, but more importantly, it represented the end of a long chase based on lies and the beginning of accountability for choices made in violence and greed. 6 months later, Cedar Falls had grown accustomed to having a federal marshal living in their midst, though Silas McGraw was unlike any lawman they had ever encountered. He still spent most of his time in the mountains with his wife, still trapped and hunted and lived by the rhythms of the wilderness. But now he also served warrants, investigated territorial crimes, and provided the kind of professional law enforcement that had been sorely lacking in their remote corner of Montana. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable, where once there had been a hermit mountain man who avoided human contact, now there was a seasoned law officer who understood both the complexities of frontier justice and the importance of building trust within the community. The badge he wore had been polished and repaired, but it carried the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. Abigail, meanwhile, had fulfilled her own dreams in ways she could never have imagined when she first said yes to a stranger's drunken proposal. The school she had established in Cedar Falls met 3 days a week in the church building, but she also traveled to scattered homesteads throughout the territory, bringing education to children who would otherwise grow up illiterate. Her reputation as a teacher was equaled only by her reputation as the woman who had helped bring the Comanche Creek Gang to justice. On this particular autumn morning, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun rise over the mountains while sharing coffee and the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to read each other's moods and thoughts. The cabin itself reflected their journey together, still practical and suited to mountain life, but softened by touches that spoke of partnership and love. "Letter from Helena," Silas said, opening an official envelope that had arrived with the previous day's mail delivery. He read silently for a moment, then smiled. "Thomas Brennan has been sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. His associate got 10 years. That seems fair," Abigail observed, "considering they spent 16 years believing they were pursuing justice instead of revenge." The judge took that into account. Also the fact that they surrendered peacefully once. They learned the truth. It had been one of the most unusual trials in territorial history. Thomas Brennan had not only confessed to his crimes, but had provided detailed testimony about the corruption of Judge Whitfield and the actual events surrounding the Comanche Creek ambush. His cooperation had helped close several other unsolved cases and had officially cleared Silas's name of any wrongdoing. Any word about the gold recovery effort? Silas consulted another paragraph in the letter. They managed to retrieve about $12,000 worth of coins from the creek bed. It's being returned to the federal treasury, with a finder's fee going to the territorial government, and the rest probably scattered from here to the Missouri River by now. Some prospector might find individual coins for the next 100 years, but the bulk of it is gone, for good. Abigail nodded, then reached for her own piece of correspondence, a letter from a publisher in Chicago who had expressed interest in her book manuscript. Practical Wisdom for Frontier Women had grown from a few scattered notes into a comprehensive guide covering everything from household management in isolated conditions to medical care when no doctor was available. The publisher's initial response had been encouraging. though he had requested some revisions to make the content more accessible to Eastern readers. "How's the book coming?" Silas asked, noting her expression as she read. "Mr. Patterson wants me to add a chapter about marriage and partnership," she said, looking up with amusement. "Apparently, word about our unconventional courtship has spread beyond Montana territory. What kind of advice would you give about marriage?" Abigail considered the question seriously. "I suppose I'd start with the importance of seeing people clearly instead of accepting assumptions. That real partnership requires both people to be willing to grow and change. That love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day." Sounds like wisdom worth sharing. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of riders, Marshal Jake Brennan and two territorial officials who had become frequent visitors since Silas's return to active duty. Jake had proven to be an honest and capable lawman whose relationship with his criminal brother had been one of the painful revelations to emerge from the Comanche Creek investigation. "Morning, Marshal McGraw, Mrs. McGraw," Jake called as he dismounted. "Mind if we join you for coffee? Got some business to discuss." As they gathered around the small table that had become an informal headquarters for territorial law enforcement, Abigail reflected on how completely their lives had changed. A year ago, she had been the pitied spinster of Cedar Falls, while Silas had been a hermit hiding from his past. Now they were respected members of their community, partners in both marriage and in the broader work of building civilization in the wilderness. "We've got reports of cattle rustling down in the Bitterroot Valley," Jake began, unfolding a territorial map on the table. "Organized operation, probably 20 head stolen so far. The local ranchers are asking for federal intervention." Silas studied the map, noting distances and terrain features with the eye of someone who understood both law enforcement and wilderness travel. "How long would we be gone?" "A week to 10 days, probably. It's rough country, but nothing you couldn't handle." "We?" Abigail asked, noting her husband's phrasing. "If you're interested in coming along. These cases sometimes require someone who can talk to the ranch wives, get information that the men might not share with male officers." It was an unusual suggestion, but Abigail had already proven her capabilities in dangerous situations. More importantly, she had discovered that she enjoyed the intellectual challenges of investigation and the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice. "I'd like that," she said, surprising everyone, including herself. "It would give me material for the book, and I've never seen the Bitterroot Valley." As they planned the upcoming investigation, discussing routes and resources, evidence gathering and legal procedures, both Silas and Abigail felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. They were no longer hiding from life or accepting limitations imposed by others. They were actively engaged in building something better, both for themselves and for the community they served. Later that afternoon, as their official visitors departed, and they resumed their quiet routine, Abigail found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The cruel bet that had seemed like the end of hope had actually been the beginning of everything she had ever wanted, but had been afraid to pursue. "Silas," she said, as they prepared dinner together in their expanded kitchen, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't made that bet?" He paused in his chopping of vegetables, considering the question. "I'd probably still be living alone up here, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. You'd probably still be working at the general store, taking care of everyone else's needs while ignoring your own. Do you regret any of it? The way it started, the complications it brought?" Silas set down his knife and turned to face his wife, reaching for her hands with the easy affection that had developed between them. "I regret that it took me so long to find you," he said simply. "I regret the years we both wasted accepting less than what we deserved. But I don't regret a single moment from the day you surprised me by saying yes to my foolish proposal." Abigail smiled, thinking of her mother's recipe book and all the wisdom it contained about love, partnership, and building a life worth living. Mother always said that the best marriages start with practical foundation and grow into something beautiful. I think she would have approved of how ours began, even if it started as a bet, especially because it started as a bet. It means we chose each other without illusions, without expectations based on appearance or social standing. We had to build everything from scratch, and that made it stronger. That evening they sat by their fireplace with the new wedding rings they had purchased to replace the hastily bent wire from their original ceremony. The gold bands caught the firelight, reflecting their faces and symbolizing the transformation of their relationship from desperate arrangement to deep partnership. Their chess set occupied its usual place on the table, pieces arranged for a game. They would probably start after dinner. The hand-carved figures had acquired a patina of use and affection, representing not just Silas's growing skill as a craftsman, but his recognition of Abigail's intelligence and his desire to provide her with challenges worthy of her mind. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Abigail said, as she worked on her book manuscript by lamplight, "about advice for frontier marriages. What conclusions have you reached? That the most important thing isn't compatibility or shared interests or even physical attraction, though all of those help. It's the willingness to see your partner clearly and love what you see, even when what you see changes over time." Silas looked up from the legal documents he was reviewing for their upcoming case. "You've changed considerably since we married. Are you worried I might not love who you're becoming?" "Are you?" "I'm excited to see who you're becoming. The woman who was brave enough to marry a stranger has become someone who stands up to armed criminals, teaches children to read, writes books, and helps solve territorial crimes. I'm not losing you to these changes. I'm discovering new reasons to admire you." It was perhaps the most romantic thing he had ever said to her, and Abigail felt the familiar warmth that came from being truly seen and appreciated by the person who mattered most. "The same is true for you," she replied. "The mountain man I married was impressive, but the federal marshal who reclaimed his badge and his sense of purpose is extraordinary. You're not the same person who made that bet in Murphy's saloon." "Neither are you." "No," she agreed, "I'm not. I'm better." Outside their cabin, the mountain night settled around them with the comfortable familiarity of home. Inside, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely circumstances continued building a life that neither had dared to imagine when they first exchanged vows in the little church in Cedar Falls. On the kitchen shelf, Abigail's mother's recipe book sat beside her daughter's growing manuscript. 2 generations of wisdom about creating something nourishing from simple ingredients, careful attention, and love. The marshal's badge in Silas's shirt pocket caught the lamplight as he leaned back in his chair. No longer a symbol of shame or abandonment, but of duty willingly accepted and honor restored. And on the table between them, the chess pieces waited for their next game, carved with the patience and skill of a man who had learned that the most beautiful things in life, love, partnership, trust, required time, attention, and the courage to risk your heart on someone who might surprise you. The mountain man had indeed married the fattest woman in town as a bet. But that night, and every night since, had changed everything, transforming 2 lonely people into partners, 2 strangers into lovers, and a cruel joke into the foundation of genuine happiness. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. And sometimes when you're brave enough to say yes to an impossible situation, you discover that impossibility was just another word for possibility in disguise. In the quiet comfort of their mountain home, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Silas and Abigail McGraw settled in for another peaceful evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases to solve, new opportunities to serve their community and each other. But tonight they had everything they had ever wanted but hadn't known how to ask for. A true partnership, built on respect and strengthened by love, that had transformed them both into better versions of themselves. The bet was long forgotten. The love would last forever.